Saying it's playing and it's not.
Is the sound coming through the HDMI?
Somebody was messing with this. I'm going to leave it alone. We don't need it.
I can look at it.
No, that's all right. Let's keep going. It's going to waste time. All right, I had a technical difficulty. We'll do this song later. But let's get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is the 14th annual Grand Lake U.S. Constitution Week. We could not do this without our sponsors, and we have our sponsor boards here. Rick and Cindy Johnson, Grand Spirit, which is Mike and Jackie Tompkins, and Katie, are we Facebook Live? Let's say a shout out to Mike and Jackie Tompkins. They are in South Carolina. They couldn't make it. So hello, Mike. Hello, Jackie. We miss you. I believe they're going to try to make it out next year. So they're one of our prime sponsors. We got Rick and Cindy Johnson, Sun Outdoors. We've got Cole with Hydrotech. And then we've got... And then we're doing our youth appreciation, so we have our lineup for that. We've got Gretchen and Brian Reynolds, and they're part of the youth appreciation for the putt-putt golf. And I don't know if Dave Raffelli's here. He's offering go-karts. So we thank our sponsors. We thank our board of directors. Raise your hand if you're on the Grand Lake U.S. Constitution Board. Thank you, thank you. And thank you to all of our volunteers also. Give a shout out to the people at the merchandise table, all the volunteers. And give a shout out to you folks for coming, taking time out of your day to be a part of this event. It's so important. Let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance Is anybody interested in, okay, let me back up a little bit. We have snacks in the back and coffee and water. That's all complimentary. Help yourselves. And then do we have any veterans in the audience? If so, stand up or raise your hand. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Do you have anybody who's here for the first time? Raise your hand. All right. Thank you for being here. Anybody from out of state? Wow. So where are some of you folks from? Nebraska. Indiana. Where else? Ohio, Texas. Well, welcome to Colorado. Welcome to Grand Lake. And welcome to the 14th annual Grand Lake U.S. Constitution Week. And we're going to put up the schedule here in a minute. There's schedules in the back, so you can look at those. And my schedule's here. Katie's going to try to pull one up. I thought I put it on the desktop. Okay. You can look at the schedules. Please take a schedule for this week. I won't go through everything. But obviously, we're having a speaker today, and then Tuesday we have a speaker at noon. We also have a speaker at 5 p.m. That's Brian Blumenfeld. And then Wednesday we're going to be in the community house at noon, and we're doing a movie there. It's the American Constitution, and it should be interesting because the author or the filmmaker is going to zoom in for the question and answer part. So that'll be fun. That's at the community center Wednesday day. And then we're going to have a trivia contest. I think we finally got somebody to run that for us. Mike would normally do that, and they're back in South Carolina. And then we have somebody who's a retired professor from Hillsdale College, and he's speaking at 5 o'clock on Wednesdays. Thursdays, we're doing a round table with the veterans, and that's at noon. And then at 5 o'clock, we've got Thomas Cranenwitter, and he's speaking. And then Fridays are youth appreciation, and it's going to be really exciting this year. We have the Sons of the American Revolution, the Colorado chapter, and they're going to be coming out, going to be doing presentations, and they're going to show the students how to load a musket and how to fire it, and then they're going to take us back to 1775, colonial days, the revolutionary days. That should be fun, and then there'll be free pizza for the youth, and then they have the afternoon to have some fun, putt-putt golf, go-karts, things like that. And then we have that Friday evening, we have another speaker. His name's Alan Thomas, and then Saturday's our big day with the parade. We'll be in the town square, and then we'll also be doing our keynote speaker this year, probably everybody knows, is Professor Jonathan Turley, and his speech is going to be free speech in an age of rage, and it couldn't be more appropriate for that speech. And let me transition from that. Last week, we saw an American citizen assassinated, probably because of his political opinions, probably his Christian opinions too. No American citizen, for any reasons whatsoever, and we all know this, should be assassinated for their First Amendment rights. I don't care who it is. I don't care who it is. That is not what America's built on. And we all know that, and we need to make sure that we go out and we find common ground with everybody. We're all Americans. Let's make sure that we find that common ground and we share that common ground, and let's take it down a notch or two, or a lot more than that. And I'd like to take a moment of silence for Charlie Kirk, but also for our nation, that God would heal this nation from this poison that's happening. Let's take a moment of silence, please. Thank you. A couple of quick announcements. If you haven't signed in yet, the table's out there for sign in. Please make sure you do sign in. And also another announcement is we need some people to help build the stage, and that would be at 2 p.m. on Wednesday. This Wednesday, we still need 4 people. We transport the stage over to the town square, and then we get it built, and we do need some help. Something exciting about this 14th annual Grand Lake U.S. Constitution Week is the following. As you probably know, America, how do I want to say this? We are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Next year, July the 4th, 2026, will be 250 years of the signing of that great document. And the celebrations have already started. They started this 4th of July. They go all the way around next year. So we're a little early for the celebrations, but we are part of the celebrations. We signed up. The other thing that's happening too is there's the Colorado 150. So there's the America 250 celebration in combination in Colorado with the Colorado 150, where it's been 150 years for the state of Colorado to become part of the Union. So that celebration that's kicked off July the 4th and it's going all the way around. And then we have signed up, and Grand Lake U.S. Constitution is officially part of the celebration. So give a hand about that. We're really excited about that, and you can see we put a America 250 flag up here. We got one over there, and then I went out and I bought a nice new shirt, 1776 for the occasion. So let's celebrate America 250 as part of this week. Let's really enjoy America. Let's celebrate this patriotism. And so I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. And on top of that, we have merchandise that says 1776, 2026, 250 years of freedom, Grand Lake U.S. Constitution Week. So we have hats, we have pins, we have tote bags, and we have stickers. So please go over to the merchandise table and pick up some merchandise. One thing I mentioned about Jonathan Turley, we do have a meet and greet Saturday evening at the Gateway Inn at 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. We're going to be doing a meet and greet. We have appetizers to be served, a cash bar, and he's going to do a book signing. So you can get tickets either online or at the merchandise table. So come out and enjoy that. That's going to be really exciting. And then also, don't forget the silent auction over here. Morgan put that together. She did a beautiful job, and go ahead and put some offers in. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Professor Robert Natelson has been here now, 13 of the 14 years he has spoken at Grand Lake U.S. Constitution Week. Let's give him a big hand for being part of this. And he's definitely one of our favorite speakers. I have pulled up, because on our webpage, we abbreviated it for all our speakers. It's like a one-pager, but I've pulled up some information on him, and it is an epistle. This gentleman has done amazing things over the years. Robert Natelson is nationally known. He's a nationally known constitutional scholar, an author whose research into the history and legal meaning of the Constitution has been cited repeatedly at the U.S. Supreme Court, both by parties and by justices. For example, justices have cited his works 17 times in 5 different cases since 2013. During the Supreme Court term ending in June 2016, parties referenced his work in 12 different briefs and petitioned for certiorari. He's widely acknowledged to be the country's leading scholar on the Constitution's amendment procedure and among the leaders on several other topics. He was a law professor for 25 years, serving at 3 different universities where, among other subjects, he taught constitutional law, constitutional history, advanced constitutional law, and First Amendment. Professor Natelson is currently the senior fellow in constitutional jurisprudence at the Heartland Institute in Arlington Heights, Illinois. He's also part of the Institute in Colorado here, the Institute in Denver. And he has a new book out, so it's the 4th edition of his book, and it is amazing. He's done such extensive research. And what I liked about your book, Rob, is that you go back and say, this is how grants were made back in the 1700s, and this is how they structured legal documents, and it puts a whole new light on when you read the Constitution, that this is how they wrote, and it really gives a good perspective. So we are honored, and I would like to introduce Robert Natelson. Thank you.
I always love to come to my favorite place to talk about my favorite topic. Thank you for coming. I have 3 daughters. 2 of them live in Montana. 1 until recently lived in Colorado, but for various reasons she had to move to Minnesota. And so I let them know what the topic was that I would be addressing this evening. The ancient Rome and the Constitution. And my middle daughter, Deborah, who, by the way, has spent some time here in Grand Lake, my middle daughter, Deborah, says, "Daddy, that topic is so you." And I said, "Not really, because if it were so me, it would be ancient Rome, the Constitution, hiking, skiing, and dinosaurs." I fell in love with the study of ancient Rome when I was 11 years old. And as a young man, long out of school, I was 32, began the study of Latin just to be able to access ancient Roman documents. And I thought it was so important that I spoke it and speak it exclusively with my daughters. So that's how I communicate to them. Anyway, my wife couldn't be here tonight, so I sent my daughters an email yesterday in Latin, and it starts off, Daddy to his daughters. In Latin writing, you don't say dear daughters, you say Daddy to his daughters. I will be in Grand Lake until Wednesday. Please, while I'm gone, please call your mother. Okay? So my youngest daughter thinks it would be really cool to take this Latin email and run it through Google Translate. And this is what came out. The Pope to his daughters. While I am in Grand Lake, you can call me Mama. I actually had a few second thoughts, despite my love for ancient Rome. I had a few second thoughts when I started getting into this topic, because it is vast. It is huge. It is like as large as the Roman Empire. And I don't know how I'm going to be able to put it all into an hour or so tonight. I'm going to try with the help of this PowerPoint. I had some videos to show you. Unfortunately, we can't get the videos to work. However, they relate to this. Last year, there was this chatter over the internet. A British woman had noticed that her husband thought a lot about ancient Rome. And she wondered if this was common among British and American men. And so she started encouraging her friends to ask their husbands and boyfriends how often they thought about ancient Rome. And what they discovered is that British and American men think about ancient Rome a great deal. There are videos on the internet, 2 of which I was going to show you, discussing this phenomenon. including a rap musical from Saturday Night Live, in which three women express deep concern because their husbands aren't talking to them anymore. Their husbands seem to be lost somewhere. And they're all concerned about that because they think that maybe their husbands might be thinking about other women. And so they ask their husbands, honey, what are you thinking about? And the answer is, well, I'm just thinking about Rome, Rome, ancient Rome. And this goes on for 3 minutes. So the American men are still apparently fascinated by ancient Rome. However, that is nothing compared to the fascination that the founding generation had for ancient Rome. And when I talk about the founding generation, I talk about the people who live from 1763 until about 1791. 1763 is when Great Britain decides that she's going to pull the reins in on her colonies. Unfortunately, the colonies didn't want to have the reins pulled in on them, right? And they started pushing back. And that led to the Revolution. It led to the Declaration of Independence, to the adoption of the Articles of Confederation, and eventually the Constitution, and its approval by 13 states, and then its final approval by the 14th state, Vermont. So that's the period of time we're talking about when I speak about the founding generation. They were fascinated with ancient Rome. Let's take a look at the dollar bill. This dollar bill, by the way, is not a founding era dollar bill, but it does have some founding era stuff on it. Specifically, if you look, it has the Great Seal of the United States. On the left is the back of the Great Seal of the United States. And on the right is the front of the Great Seal of the United States. And as the slide indicates, it was adopted by the Confederation Congress in 1782. Now, I realize it's a little blurry and a little far for you to see things in detail, but you can pull out a dollar bill if you like and see for yourself. Over on the left-hand side, we have a legend, a saying, Annuit coeptis, written in Latin. Annuit coeptis means he has approved our undertakings, meaning God. God has approved our undertakings. The eye that you see there is the all-seeing eye of providence. Underneath it, we have yet another Latin inscription, Novus Ordo Seclorum. That means new order of the ages. The founding of America by the decision of the American people represents something entirely new in history. That's what the seal is trying to communicate. The top inscription, Annuit coeptis, is an abbreviation of not one, but two lines of poetry written by the Roman poet Virgil. The two lines appear first in Virgil's great poem about agriculture called the Georgics. Georgios, George, it means farmer. The Georgics. It also is a paraphrase of a line that appears in Virgil's great epic, which tells of the founding of the Roman people, the Aeneid. Now let's go over to the right side. We have an eagle. That ring any bells? What do the Roman legions carry, right? What was their standard? Eagles. There's an eagle, and in the eagle's beak, there's a banner. And the banner says E pluribus unum, or to say it in Latin, E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. With the exception of a change of a single letter that is an exact quote from a Roman poem called the Moretum, which means the salad or pesto, which during the founding generation people believed had been written by Virgil. It might have been written by Virgil, but many scholars don't think so. But the point is that here you see 4 different references to Rome, 3 of them to Virgil on the Great Seal of the United States. Sometimes when you are listening to the State of the Union address, the president gives the State of the Union address from the halls of from the dais of the House of Representatives, right? So if you happen to be watching the State of the Union, or if you happen to be watching, God knows why, House of Representatives proceedings on C-SPAN, you'll see the dais. And you'll notice that behind the dais are these 2 things. What are these? These are called fasces. They are bundles of rods fastened together. One rod is easily cracked, but rods fastened together in unity is incredibly strong. And also in the rods, in the fasces, at the top of each one, there's the head of an axe. The fasces were what the bodyguards of leading Roman magistrates carried. If you were a consul in Rome, you were followed by a group of men called lictors, and they carried fasces. And these fasces wind up in the hall of the House of Representatives of the United States. The founders were fascinated with ancient Rome, just like modern men. But unlike modern men, the founders knew an enormous amount about ancient Rome. If you were a girl in the founding era and you sought an education, they would teach you about things that were practical, like music and arithmetic and French and Italian. But if you were a boy, once you finished learning your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s, you started the study of Latin, generally at age 8. And if you stuck with it long enough, for the next 6 years, your entire education centered around Latin and the Latin classics. You read Cicero, you read Ovid, you read Virgil, and so forth. You studied historians. If you were one of the minority of boys who was headed to college, you also started Greek, although a little later, and you did not attain that kind of proficiency in Greek that you had in Latin. But by the time you went to college, you had to be good enough to be able to read the New Testament in Greek, because the New Testament, by and large, is easy Greek. Not only did you have to be good enough to read the New Testament in Greek, you had to be good enough that when given a passage of the New Testament, you could translate it into Latin. If you attended college, it was more of the same, but at a more advanced level. You studied more advanced, more difficult authors like Seneca and Tacitus. You read the leading Greek texts. And of course, you also studied things like history and geography and science and so forth. Only a minority of boys went to college, but this minority had an outsized impact on public opinion. And here's one reason why. Most Americans at the time, even though there were no public schools, or maybe because there were no public schools, most Americans were literate. And they read extensively. And they particularly liked to read almanacs. You've all heard probably of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanacs. That was only one of many. There were many of them. Franklin was not a college graduate, although he educated himself. But most of the almanacs were edited, published by college graduates. And they were always sticking little notations about classical things in those almanacs. So you could actually pick up a lot of Roman history, Greek history, and so forth, even if you'd not gone to college, simply by reading almanacs. So college education also tended to filter indirectly throughout the population. There were a number of authors who were particular favorites. One of them is a Greek. The only verified name we have for him is Polybius. I'll tell you a little bit about him. As you can see, he's born about 200 years before Christ. He was born in the Peloponnese, that is in southern Greece. I know we have at least one person here who knows what the Peloponnese is. In a town called Megalopolis. You know, you hear the word Megalopolis, you think it's really big, but it wasn't very big. It's a little town. His dad was a prominent citizen of that town. He was a town councilor. And Polybius, before he was 30 years old, also was elected to the town council. And then something happened that ended Polybius's political career and changed his life. The Romans had been fighting several wars against Macedonia in the area of Greece, and they were very concerned to ensure that the Greek city-states never took up arms against the Roman Republic. And so the Romans issued an ultimatum to these Greek city-states. We're taking some of your young men as hostages. They're coming with us to Italy. If you ever raise arms against them, you need to fear for the safety of the hostages. Polybius was one of those hostages. Now, sounds awful, but as to the treatment of hostages, the Romans were not Hamas, okay? The hostages were well treated. They were allowed to travel around Italy. They couldn't leave Italy, but they were allowed to travel around Italy. Polybius himself, bright young man, met some of the leading scholars and city leaders of Rome. Among them, Scipio Africanus the Younger, the guy who later destroyed Carthage. In fact, he became Scipio Africanus's mentor. And Scipio introduced him to scholars throughout Rome and throughout Italy. Polybius came up with an idea. His idea was, I'd like to explain to my fellow Greeks how it is that Rome became so powerful so fast. And so he wrote a history, most of which survives, much of which survives, which I hardly recommend, that explains how the Roman Republic rose so quickly. And one of the things in particular he mentioned was the nature of the Roman Constitution. Aristotle had observed that you could have a good government that was a monarchy. You could have a good government that was an aristocracy. You could have a good government that was a democracy. But there was always the danger of these good governments degenerating into something vile. A monarchy could become a tyranny. An aristocracy could become an oligarchy. A democracy could become mob rule. That was Aristotle's observation. Polybius's observation is that the Roman Constitution is almost unique in that it has elements of monarchy and elements of aristocracy and elements of democracy, and they all check each other to keep the system stable. And as a result, the Constitution does not deteriorate. You've got four, I didn't put them all here, popular assemblies. That's democracy. You have a Senate, which is more of an executive than a legislative body. That's aristocracy. You have consuls. They have the power that the kings of Rome had before the Republic was set up. And they all check each other. This insight by Polybius turned out to be repeated by Cicero, repeated by others, and enormously influential in the drafting of our own Constitution. Now we come to Cicero. Cicero was a consul, he was a statesman, he was a great advocate in court, he was a great orator. His speeches were written down generally by him. Something like 50 of them still survive. The speeches were viewed as models of oratory, still are, thousands of years later. Cicero's greatest contribution, however, was this. Late in his life, he wrote a series of books that included essays, dialogues, philosophical works that were based on Greek philosophy. He was creative about it, but basically what he was doing is he was taking Greek learning, and by the way, when I use the word philosophy, that has kind of an otherworldly feel. Philosophy included things like science, right? Routine science would be called natural philosophy. It would include political science, political philosophy, and so forth. He took much of this Greek learning, and put it into Latin. And so Romans who didn't know Greek had access now to Greek philosophy. And even more important than that, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Latin remained the language of learning throughout all of Western Europe, and remained so up until about the year 1800. And that enabled people to access Greek learning through Latin. Cicero was not just a Roman statesman, although he was a great one. He was a major transmitter of Western civilization. Cicero had a number of political concepts that he emphasized. I'll just mention one right now. That is the idea that government is a public trust. In other words, you take a political job, you serve on your town council, or you serve as mayor, or you serve as governor. Your obligation is to work for the people, not for yourself. And if you work for yourself, you breach that trust. I see heads nodding because we're all familiar with this concept. The concept originated with Aristotle, but it was Cicero who transmitted it to us. And it became a major value underlining the U.S. Constitution. Next favorite author, Publius Vergilius Maro, Virgil. People in the founding generation read a number of Roman poets, but probably the greatest and the one they liked the best was Virgil. I called Virgil, in a recent scholarly article I wrote, I called Virgil the poet laureate of the American founding. And that's because he was quoted more than anybody else in the debates over the Constitution. People were always throwing Virgil at each other. And we'll give you a few examples later on. Livy, Titus Livius, Roman historian, another favorite of the founding generation. I think the reason that the founders liked him so much is that he wrote about republican virtue. He wrote about heroes who exemplified republican values. And of course, the founders who were setting up a republic ate that stuff up. There's a story about Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was not a college graduate. He was not a particularly bookish guy. He was a talker, not very bookish. But by the time he was 15, his father had him read Livy, and then Patrick Henry reread Livy's history in English every year for the rest of his life in order to get inspiration. Say a little bit about him later on, too. The next one is Cornelius Tacitus, or Tacitus. probably considered by most experts to be the greatest of all the Roman historians. He's amazing. His Latin is incredibly difficult, but he is really amazing. Seems to do everything right. He wrote about the early Roman Empire after Augustus, and he wrote about the corruption and the dissolution in the ruling class. Now, you understand this didn't cause a dissolution of the empire. The empire went on for another 1,400 years. But the point is that he identified bad government. He was a source of moral bad lessons, things that you should not do. And then finally, Plutarch. Like Polybius, Plutarch was a Greek. But like Polybius, he was a citizen of the Roman Empire. And like Polybius, he wrote about Roman things. Plutarch wrote a series of essays on morals that were very admired among the founders. But anybody know his most famous contribution? His biographies. Plutarch wrote several dozen biographies. And the way what he would do is he would take a great Greek leader and write a biography about this Greek. And then he would pick a Roman leader whose life trajectory was a lot like the Greek, and he would pair them with it. He'd write the Roman biography, and then he'd write a summary, and he would say, well, you know, Demosthenes was a great orator, and Cicero was a great orator. Here are the ways in which they were different. Here are the ways in which one was more successful than the other, and so forth. And he did that with a number of other pairings. He also paired Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. You see the pattern. In 1579, a man named Thomas North took Plutarch's biographies, they're called his lives, and he translated them into English. And they were a credible smash hit among people who couldn't read Latin, or couldn't read Greek, excuse me. And among those was William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare actually did have a good Latin education, but he didn't know Greek. And William Shakespeare used several of these works by Plutarch to create his plays. Julius Caesar, for example. That play is really based on Thomas North's translation of Plutarch. Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, to name three. Now, I'm going to say something about Roman history generally to try to put the founders' interest into perspective. When you read your history book, you probably read that the Roman Empire fell in the year 476. It is true that in 476, the Emperor of the West was kicked off his throne by a Visigothic king. But the Roman Empire continued because there was a Roman Empire in the East. In fact, that Visigothic king who kicked out the last Roman emperor then took an oath of allegiance to the Eastern emperor. So the Roman state actually continued, and it continued until Constantinople was finally destroyed by the Turks in 1453. So we're talking about a government here that in one form or another went on for 2,000 years. Here's another way of approaching it, using a timeline. This term principate, I should mention, this refers to the early empire. For technical reasons, it's called the principate, as opposed to the dominate of the later empire. The founders were mostly interested in the middle part of this. They were mostly interested in the years surrounding the lives of Jesus Christ and Caesar Augustus. Period of about 300 years, extending from 200 BCE, or if you prefer, 200 BC, all the way up to a little after 100 CE or AD, if you prefer. By the way, notice this picture of Augustus. That doesn't look like anything you've probably ever seen before. When we see pictures of Augustus, what we see are white statues, right? In recent years, what artists have been doing is they've been taking various statues of leading figures like Augustus and Cicero and using their own artistic ability, plus Photoshop, plus artificial intelligence, to recreate what these men actually looked like. And I think this is a pretty good one. It's pretty likely that as a young man, Octavian or Augustus looked something like this. We're zeroing in on that 300-year period I mentioned. You can see that all of the people I mentioned as favorites of the founding generation were in this period. Here's Polybius, here's Cicero, Virgil, Livy, Plutarch, Tacitus, and for perspective, Augustus and Jesus. To give you a feel for the size of the empire, this is the Roman Republic at the time when Polybius was 60. All of this was controlled by Rome, not just the orange part. When Cicero was 60, the Roman Republic looked like this. And when Tacitus was 60, what was now the Roman Empire had reached its greatest extent. The founders drew lessons from Roman and Greek materials. They drew history lessons. They drew moral lessons. They drew lessons in rhetoric. They drew constitutional lessons. They learned these lessons partly by reading Roman and Greek authors directly, but also by reading more modern authors who in turn relied heavily on Greek and Roman authors. Think, for example, of Montesquieu. When you learn about the Constitution, you learn that the French philosopher Montesquieu was influential on the founders. Montesquieu quotes Roman and Greek authors all the time. So also does Blackstone, the legal authority that was relied upon more than anyone else by the founders. We'll take an example here. Plutarch and Polybius wrote about ancient Greek confederacies. The Greek city-states often formed unions of one kind or another. They formed confederacies. When our founders were considering how to structure the Constitution, one of the things they did is they studied Plutarch and Polybius carefully to understand how the Greek confederacies worked. How were they composed? Did they survive? Did they break down? Why did they break down? What can we learn from their mistakes? And what can we avoid in the way of mistakes? Here's John Adams, for example. John Adams wrote an encyclopedia of Republican governments. At the time the Constitution was adopted, Adams was in Europe serving as a diplomat. But the first volume of this encyclopedia of Republican governments that he wrote circulated widely in the United States, including at the Constitutional Convention. And sure enough, Adams had extensive material from Polybius and Plutarch about the Greek confederacies. Here's another example from the Federalist Papers. This is Federalist number 18. written by James Madison. Remember, this is written for the general public. Among the confederacies of antiquity, the most considerable was that of the Grecian republics, associated under the Amphictyonic Council. Try saying that 5 times straight. Amphictyonic Council. One historian said that the leading founders never forgot the Amphictyonic Council, and they never let anybody else forget it either. From the best accounts, Madison, from the best accounts transmitted of this celebrated institution, the best accounts meaning Polybius and Plutarch, it bore a very instructive analogy to the present confederation of the American states. And he goes on to say that the great weakness in the Amphictyonic Council is that the people didn't vote for members of the council, nor could the council operate directly on the people. It was simply member states, like in the Articles of Confederation. And he deduced from that the lesson that the new federal government should be elected directly or indirectly by the people and also be able to act directly upon the people and not just merely upon the states. That's a lesson that he took from Plutarch and Polybius' treatment of the Amphictyonic Council. Another lesson from the Greek confederacies was this. Most of the Greek confederacies, most of the members of the confederacies, the city-states that belonged, were republics. They might be democratic republics, they might be aristocratic republics, but Athens, Sparta, cities like that were republics. But in one of these councils, they admitted a monarchy as a member. The monarchy was Macedonia. And the monarch at the time was none other than Philip II, Alexander the Great's father. And as soon as he comes into the Confederacy, what's he start doing? He starts expanding his own power and trying to take over the Confederacy. And from that, the founders learned that the American Union must never include a monarchy. Colorado may not declare a king. It's not permitted. The United States Constitution says that the federal government will guarantee every state a Republican form of government because they did not want a Philip II in Colorado trying to take over Wyoming, for example, as desirable as that might be. Another set of lessons were moral. What should people be like? How should women and men conduct themselves? There was no better handbook to learning how men and women should conduct themselves than the stories told by the Roman historian Livy. Livy told the story of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, and by the way, Cincinnati is named for him. Cincinnatus was a Roman leader way back in the 5th century before Christ. And it was a time when the Roman Republic was just a little city-state. He became consul, and then once he was finished being consul, he went home. And he farmed his own land. He pushed his own plow. Well, unfortunately, after he was gone, Rome got involved in a war. And Rome was losing the war and was surrounded on all sides. The Senate recognized that something had to be done, and it had to be done by somebody who was an excellent general. And Cincinnatus was no longer in power. He was back on his farm, but he had proved himself. So the Senate sent a delegation to Cincinnatus, found him actually plowing in his field, and said, "We need a good general, and you're the best general we've got. We need you now. We're going to declare you dictator." That's a Roman office. You get to be dictator, you have near absolute power for 6 months, and 6 months only. That was the rule. But we want you to get us out of this mess. And so Cincinnatus goes into his villa, puts on his toga, goes off to Rome. He rallied the army. He marched against the enemy. He fought the enemy. He defeated the enemy. He saved the city, all in the period of 16 days. Whereupon he immediately turned over the signals of power, gave up his office, and went back to the farm. Does that remind you at all of any great American? Well, George Washington was considered the American Cincinnatus. He was the guy who really preferred to be in Mount Vernon. But he came forward, he fought the revolution, he defeated the British, and instead of declaring himself military dictator, he went back to Congress and gave up his power. And then he later became president, and he could have run for a third term. He went back home. His job is done. The American Cincinnatus. The inspiration comes from Livy. Livy told another story. He told a story of a man named Fabius. Fabius was another great general. But this happened later in Roman history. It happened when the Romans were fighting Hannibal, or at least trying to fight Hannibal. Hannibal was sweeping throughout Italy. The Romans sent armies repeatedly against him, and Hannibal repeatedly destroyed them. The Senate finally turned to Fabius, and Fabius says, I think I've got a better way. And so Fabius decided to wage guerrilla warfare. He avoided pitched battles, formal battles, because Hannibal always won those. And so what he did instead, attack by night, attack small detachments, retreat, don't allow yourself to be captured, play a war of maneuver. Does that sound like any founding era general? Yes, it is. It's how George Washington fought the revolution. And that's why the founders celebrated him as the American Fabius. Oddly enough, for his own personal model, George Washington didn't choose either Cincinnatus or Fabius. George Washington's personal model was another Roman hero, Cato the Younger. Cicero is also a moral example, mostly because how he conducted himself when he was consul. When he was consul, he faced a very dangerous revolution led by a man named Catiline, who was an extremely talented and unscrupulous character. Cicero couldn't, for various political reasons, Cicero could not take Catiline on directly. So he maneuvered Catiline into the position of having to leave Rome. In a very famous speech depicted here on the slide, Cicero attacked Catiline in such words that the entire Senate was persuaded, and everybody in the Senate moved away from Catiline, leaving him there alone. That convinced him to leave the city. Throughout the debates over the Constitution, you see proponents of the Constitution and opponents of the Constitution trading insults. Our side, we're Cicero's. You're just a bunch of Catilines. Both sides did this. Proponents of the Constitution characterized opponents as Catilines. Opponents of the Constitution characterized proponents as Catilines. And of course, every side identified itself with Cicero. And there's Tacitus on the corruption of power. The anti-federalists were very concerned that the federal government would become too powerful. And they were also concerned that the new government would become corrupt. And so they often used the words of Tacitus as a way to bring home their message. There was a Rhode Island anti-federalist, a Rhode Island opponent of the Constitution. We don't actually know who it was, because all these guys used pseudonyms, right? And they mostly used pseudonyms from Greek and Roman history. This particular Rhode Island opponent of the Constitution, he wrote under the name of Cato Jr. He relied on Tacitus to show that corrupt governments endeavor to corrupt the people. I think that some of the things we've gone through fairly recently justify my reading exactly what Cato Jr. has to say in his paraphrasing of Tacitus. Ill governments, subsisting by vice and rapine, are jealous of private virtue and enemies to private property. Hence it is that to drain, worry, and debauch their subjects are the steady maxims of their politics. To drain their subjects, meaning to overtax them, to worry, to wage lawfare against them or to overregulate them, and to debauch them, to deliberately promote immorality, are the steady maxims of their politics, their favorite arts of reigning. In this wretched situation, the people, to be safe, must be poor and lewd. Cato Jr. added that the contagion is mutual, just as a corrupt government tries to corrupt the people. The people end up corrupting the government. Again, he writes, even the Emperor Nero, that royal monster in man's shape, was adored by the common herd at Rome. Tacitus tells us those sort of people long lamented him. Another kind of lesson were lessons in rhetoric, lessons in how to say things to drive your message home. This is one of my favorite paintings. It was painted in the year 1788, just as the Constitution was being debated. It was not painted by an American. It was painted by a Swiss named Angelica Kaufmann. It was not painted in the United States. It was painted in Britain. But the theme of this painting was extremely common in the founding era. Many other painters had other versions. But I think Angelica Kaufmann's version, in my opinion, is the best. When Virgil was writing the Aeneid, Virgil told the story of a young man named Marcellus, who was the Emperor Augustus's nephew. He was a young man of very great promise. But unfortunately, he died at age 19. His mother, Augustus's sister, Octavia, obviously was devastated. Subsequently, Virgil, in his writing of the Aeneid, put in a scene in which Marcellus, this young man, was praised. Recognized as dead, but praised. The emperor invited Virgil to come to the palace to read from his unfinished work, the Aeneid, and Virgil agreed to go. When Virgil came to the passage in which he described the death and the lost promise of Marcellus, the emperor's sister, Marcellus's mother, fainted. In this painting, in the gold gown, you see Octavia, who's lost consciousness. Augustus's daughter, Julia, is ministering to her, trying to bring her to. Augustus himself is looking on with concern. Augustus's wife, Livia, is turning to Virgil and saying, "What the hell have you done?" And Virgil is dropping his manuscript and saying, "What the hell have I done?" It's an illustration of the power of Roman rhetoric, of Roman poetry. Many of the opponents of the Constitution believed that the Constitution was a Trojan horse. That once the Constitution was adopted, it would be like bringing the Trojan horse into the city, and it would result in the collapse of the government or the surrender of the government to aristocracy or monarchy. One anti-federalist, specifically in a newspaper article, again, written for the general public, ended with the lines, "Instamus tamen in memoris, cacique furore, et monstrer in felix, Socrates systemus arche." Yet we push forward, unmindful, blinded by madness, and erect the ill-omened monstrosity within our sacred citadel. Of course, ultimately, the arguments in favor of the Constitution proved persuasive. The Constitution was adopted in state after state. And so it was the time for advocates of the Constitution to celebrate. And one way they celebrated was by quoting Virgil. This cartoon appeared in Massachusetts newspapers. Each state is represented by a Roman column. If a state ratified, the Roman column was lifted from the horizontal position into the vertical position. And so you've got successful ratifications now by Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and Virginia is now being pushed up into a vertical position. And of course, New Hampshire is not far behind. And across the top, Radium Saturnia Regna, the return of the golden age. The return of the golden age. A line from Virgil's Eclogues. Finally, there were constitutional lessons. That is to say, the founders relied upon the Romans to give them lessons in how to write a constitution. John Adams, in his Encyclopedia of Republican Governments, quoted a number of maxims from Cicero. These are the kinds of things, he says, are important in drafting a constitution. I'll give you a few of them. Cicero says, "Law is built on justice. Where there is no justice, there is no law. A nation is not just a mass of individuals, but an association based on consent. The best constitution mixes elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Unmixed governments degenerate into corrupt forms, particularly into tyranny. A tyranny is not a true republic, because a republic is the property of the people, while in a tyranny, everything belongs to the ruler." Other participants in the constitutional debates cited Cicero to encourage such things as putting in the Constitution a presidential pardon power, Cicero's idea, or putting in the Constitution a rule banning ex post facto laws, retroactive criminal laws, another Ciceronian idea. Still another constitutional lesson was the idea of divided sovereignty. That is the idea that you can have states and the federal government each having certain powers, that you didn't have to locate all sovereignty, all power in one place. Alexander Hamilton, Federalist number 34, talks about the fact that both the states and the federal government will have a taxing power. Hamilton writes, I flatter myself it's been clearly shown in my last number that the particular states under the proposed Constitution would have co-equal authority with the Union in the article of revenue, except as to duties on imports. And he goes on to argue that this coordinate authority, with both states and federal government having coordinate powers, to argue that it cannot exist is to set up supposition and theory against fact and reality. It is well known that in the Roman Republic, the legislative authority in the last resort resided for ages in two different political bodies, not as branches of the same legislatures, but as distinct and independent legislatures. It will be readily understood that I allude to the Comitia Centuriata and the Comitia Tributa, using the Roman Constitution to explain federalism to the American people. James Madison used the Roman Senate in his argument for a strong Senate. Madison said that of all the republics in history, there have only been three that have lasted for a really long time. One was Sparta, one was Rome, one was Carthage. And all three of them had senates. Controversial matter right today. Controversy today going over presidential power. The president is trying to reclaim certain powers that have been given away to Congress. The founders did not set up an executive council. They didn't set up a government with two consuls. In this event, they rejected the Roman example of two consuls in favor of a single executive. Here's Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 70. Energy in the executive, energy means efficiency. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice. It's essential to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and anarchy. Every man the least conversant with Roman history knows how often the Republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man under the formidable title of dictator. Remember Cincinnatus? A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution. A government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. You don't have executive councils. Nevertheless, some opponents of the Constitution were not convinced. One opponent, for example, quoted Tacitus, pointing out that all of the early Roman emperors after Augustus were bad guys, that all of them turned out rotten, that de Vespasianos solus quam omnium ante principum in melius mutatus est, that only one man, Vespasian, actually turned out better than expected. All the others were slime balls. And so we shouldn't be giving so much power to the president. Wrap this up with a quick conclusion. The drafters of the Constitution, the adopters of the Constitution, were fascinated with the history of ancient Rome. And they were well educated in Roman civilization. They had learned its language, its history, and its literature. In writing and adopting the Constitution, They drew many lessons from the Roman experience, lessons in history, morality, rhetoric, and constitution writing. That's why understanding how they resorted to ancient Rome is central to a deeper understanding of the Constitution itself. Thank you. I'm conscious of the fact that it went on for a very long time. And so our time for questions is probably limited, although you can leave too, you know. But I'd be happy to take questions for a while anyway. Yes, sir. Vespasian? You know, I'm Jewish, and we don't consider Vespasian so good because he was the guy who launched the attack on Jerusalem. But actually, he was a very good emperor. After Nero died in the year 68, and there was a big power struggle, so that you had one emperor who became a proclaimed emperor, a man named Vitellius, proclaimed emperor in 68. He lasted all the way up from 68 to 69. And you had two more emperors in 69 who were acclaimed and then destroyed. Vespasian had at his command one of the largest armies in the empire because he had been in command in the East in the Jewish war. And so he was declared emperor by his troops. And once you're declared emperor by your troops, you really can't say, oh no, I'd rather go home and, you know, study history. You've got to take that up or your life is forfeit. So he led his troops on a march on Rome. And in the year 69, he defeated all rivals. In the year 69, he became emperor. He was already in his 60s, and he ruled for 10 years, but he was excellent. Nero had emptied the treasury with his enormous expenses. Vespasian was very tight with a denarius, you know, and he was a fair, honest man. He was a good man. And he left two sons, one, Titus, who also turned out to be a good man, who lived only 2 years, and another one, Domitian, who was a slime ball. And unfortunately, he lasted 15. Yes, sir. There are several reasons why they look to Rome. Remember, all of Western civilization looked to Rome. I mean, Rome was the great civilization that had come before. The Latin language was still the language of science and of scholarship. But the Roman experience, especially within this area that I'm talking about, from 200 BCE up until 100 CE, the written record is copious. I mean, we just have a lot of material from that time. The writing is excellent, and it's all very instructive. Also, the Roman Republic was the longest-lived major republic in the history of the world. The Venetians had something they called a republic, which really wasn't. But the Roman Republic was a genuine republic, lasted for almost 500 years. And so there's an enormous wealth of experience to draw on. Yes, sir. I'm not following the question here. Go ahead, try it. That I have not heard. Yeah, I've not heard that. Yeah, he was I will tell you that that the Jews had good reason not to like Nero, and the Christians had excellent reason not to like Nero. Yes? Yeah, that's what it said. The question is, was he the one who was playing his instrument when Rome was burning? That may have been a slander. There was Nero wanted to put up an enormous palace called the Golden House. The problem is that the land he wanted to use belonged to other people. And so when a fire broke out and burned down much of that quarter of the city, people accused Nero of setting it. And Nero played the lyre, and so the story was that he played the lyre while Rome burned. Nero was bad enough. You don't really have to make up stories about him. But it's possible that it has some truth, because he then did go ahead and build his enormous house. And once Vespasian became emperor, he, of course, ripped it down and used the material for other purposes. Yes, sir. I'm sorry? Thank you. Yeah, the question is there anything to be learned from Roman history about policies that President Trump is pursuing, essentially? The quick answer is yes. The complete answer, we'd be here till next week. But let me give you two examples, one of which is kind of pro-Trump. You can think of it as a pro-Trump example. And the other is kind of an anti-Trump example. The pro-Trump example is the idea of the unitary executive. That in order for the executive, the way the founders sometimes put it is, the legislative power must be divided. You must have many legislators. But the executive power has to be unified in one person. In the years since really the 1920s, Congress has been setting up agencies, administrative agencies, that are not really accountable to the president. They may have fixed terms or other restrictions on the ability of the president to govern them. And so you have policies being made by these unelected people, not subject to the control of the president. I think it would be in accord with the lessons of Roman history for President Trump to try to regain control of his executive branch. Now the example that maybe cuts a little against President Trump. President Trump took action in the District of Columbia to deal with the crime problem. He's within his power. The District of Columbia is what we call a federal enclave. It's under the control of the federal government, and a statute had given President Trump that power. But when President Trump talks about sending federal troops into Chicago, that's a different matter. Chicago is a municipality in a state. Generally speaking, in our constitutional system, states have control over ordinary policing. There is a provision whereby the president can send troops into a state to deal with crime, but you have to get the consent of either the legislature or the governor. And of course, President Trump doesn't have that. Roman history teaches us we have to be careful not to try to resolve every crisis by going to the federal government. because that's what increasingly happened during the 2nd century after Christ. Every time there was a major problem at the municipal level, somebody would say to the emperor, please intervene and cure this. And before you knew it, there was no local control, there was no local government left. Everything was controlled from the center. So that's what that's what Roman history tells us about intervention by the central government in local affairs, even when the local people are screwing things up. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, state it again.
Recently I've heard that the Trump administration has changed focus from Chicago
To Memphis.
to Memphis. And
I don't know what their reasoning is. I have no way of knowing. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that they had a consensus, the founders did, in that, in this period, that they were creating a new Rome? That kind of like a mission or an aspiration?
Were they creating a new Rome? No. I think they thought they were creating something that was truly novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. In the past, governments had been created by conquest, by usurpation, or by accident. The American government was being created by consent. That was viewed as something unique in history. So they very much wanted to learn from Rome, but they didn't want to be Rome. Yes, sir. The Declaration of Independence? I would say only that portion that talks about government protecting the rights of the people, that the purpose of government is to protect people, that the purpose of government is not to aggrandize the governors, but to protect the governed. That's Cicero's theory of public trust. Take one more, and we'll quit. Okay, you got it. Say this again. That the Constitution was the Constitution created for a moral and religious people? The founders certainly believed that morality facilitated Republican government, but they actually created the Constitution for an ambitious and self-interested people. That's why we have checks and balances. You know, there's this famous passage in the Federalist where Madison says something like, if men were angels, there would be no need for government, right? And there would be no need for government officials to be checked. Even John Adams, who is usually cited as most as talking about the importance of morality in a republic, recognized that in practice, people aren't always moral. And people in power in particular are often not moral, and they need to be checked. That having been said, there can be a level of immorality so vile that all the checks and balances in the world don't work. When you sink to that level, the republic's gone. It's been a delight talking to you. Thank you so much.